Okay, and we are now recording.
All right. David, go ahead.
Okay, well, my name is David Lee Summers, and by day I write science fiction and horror and steampunk. Sort of recent releases are The Pirates of Sufiro, which is actually my very first science fiction novel, now out in a brand new edition. And I've also got a new edition of Vampires of the Scarlet Order with a great cover by Chaz Kemp, and have edited books like A Kepler's Dozen, which is a book that basically talks about planets discovered by NASA's Kepler mission, which has now finished its mission, but now we have NASA's TESS mission, which is out finding exoplanets. And recently just came out with an article about finding real exoplanets or talking about exoplanets in science fiction for a book about NASA's Kepler mission published by NASA. So that was kind of a fun thing.
Yeah.
And by night, I operate telescopes at Kitt Peak National Observatory. So I've probably, in my writing life, I've probably actually written more about monsters and magic than science fiction, but I've written science fiction and I do care about good science in my science fiction. So Ross.
Oh, very good. And I'm Ross Lampert, and I'm very poorly prepared. I did not bring up the my books. My two books are The Eternity Plague and the sequel Chrysalis. But if you've watched my introduction video, I stumble and fumble with them up on screen then. And they are two books in a trilogy. The third book, currently titled Wild Spread, is in what I hope, knock on wood, will be one of the final drafts, and really working to get that out next year and move on to other things. That writing is my job. I do other things. I create training materials for another organization, but that's also writing and creating. I've got a bachelor's degree in physics, and yet the Eternity Plague series is all about biology and genetics. So that's been fun because that's meant doing a lot of research, and over the years, it's been amazing how much things have changed. And one of the big changes is something called CRISPR-Cas9, which I will not try to break out into the acronym out into its words because I don't remember what they are. But the two ladies who discovered it just were awarded the Nobel Prize in chemistry, and very deservedly so. It's an amazing discovery that they made back in about 2004 or so. So that's kind of what I do. So David, our topic is how do we put the science back in science fiction? I was surprised by that. I didn't know it left.
Yeah, I think it's still there, but I think, if you cruise through the science fiction section of your bookshop, or when we can eventually do that again, I think, you do see an awful lot of fantasy books and an awful lot of books that are sort of not science fiction. Certainly when you when you watch TV and watch science fiction on television or in the movies, there's certainly some dubious science in those.
Well, now that's another thing.
And I think, I actually, while you were talking about doing the research, that was when the topic was brought up, that was one of the things that I really thought of as an important point to make, is I think for anyone who wants to write good science fiction, I think what's really important is, we've become very concerned, and rightly so, about things like cultural appropriation, and how you don't, do cultural appropriation in your fiction especially when you want to write realistically multiple cultures interacting in your stories, is you research and you get to know the cultures involved in that. And I think when you're writing science fiction, I think it's very important, no matter what science you're going to put in your science fiction, or even if you very peripherally touch on science, that you kind of research the culture of science, that you research how it changes over time, you research what's going on in it, and kind of the history of the field a little bit.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good point, because, and especially if you're writing something as I am, which is near future science fiction, that becomes really important, because especially in some fields, the science is changing so quickly. I'm a slow writer, so I've been working on this series for, I won't say how long, but quite a while. And just the kinds of changes that have happened in the science itself and in the technologies surrounding the science. And then because I'm bringing in a lot of non-scientific, non-scientist characters into the story, because the story would involve, it does involve a lot of different elements of society. Yeah, now you're looking at not just necessarily racial cultures, but just other organizational cultures. One of my characters is a safety lobbyist. And so what is the world there of trying to ensure that risks are mitigated or minimized across the entire culture. So yeah, that's that can be a rabbit hole that you can really go down if you're not careful.
Yeah, and in fact, I was thinking in terms of putting the science in science fiction, sometimes actually what will drive me crazy are science fiction books that where science sort of froze at the point that whatever person who was writing this took their college physics or astronomy class, and it's clearly set in what they knew in 1990, and they haven't researched it beyond that, or they assume that that the facts that they looked up last week are always going to be the state of science as it is. It always, because it surprises some people I know when I talk to them about what's the science fiction that influenced scientists. And when walking around a place like Kitt Peak National Observatory, I find that a lot of the scientists, when you ask them, what made you want to be a scientist? And it's like, well, the show that most often comes up is Star Trek. And, it's space opera and things like that. It's not so much the really accurate science fiction of their youth. It's the stuff that had kind of a sense of adventure. And at some level, I think that's one of the things that attracts those of us into science in general, is that there is kind of this sense that there's going to be discovery. And I can imagine that with the CRISPR sense too. It's sort of this delving into this whole brave new world and kind of this whole puzzle solving kind of thing that I think all scientists have in common.
Yes, and that's very much a factor in my story. And of course, because the story involves this worldwide pandemic, gee, what's happening now? So as you can imagine, I've been taking copious notes, maybe not literally, but, oh, look at that reaction. I need to capture that somehow. Or, fortunately, we haven't gotten to a civil war, at least not yet, which is one of those things that's kind of lurking on the edges of my book. But yeah, and that raises another really important point, and picking up on what you said just a minute ago, especially for someone like me writing near future science fiction, which is really, really dangerous in a lot of ways, because things are going to change, and stuff that I'm writing about now will be either commonplace or obsolete by the time we get to the late 2030s. In a way, you have to kind of say, okay, I'm not going to project certain things because I know I'm going to be wrong one way or another. I don't know if you run across that in your writing or in your reading.
Yeah, and I think sometimes you it's kind of just the chance you almost have to take. Because at some level, science fiction writers really aren't trying to predict the future. We're writing about today, and we're writing about those social things that we're dealing with in our life, and how those might be impacted. At most it really is how that might they be impacted by science, or how science changes might impact the social issues of today.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that did occur to me in this panel topic is, where do we actually go to look for science fiction that has good science in it? And one of the things that happened to come across my desk just a few days ago was, it turns out that there's a fellow for the Astronomical Society of the Pacific who actually collects and collates good astronomy in science fiction, and has a whole 23-page recommended reading list from the whole history of science fiction. I think it was last updated in 2019, and he's within a couple of years. So there's stuff on there up to 2017 on the list. And if anyone wants to look for that, that is, I have it actually here on my other screen. It's at astrosociety.org. And if you go to the education page, and then there's a link on there for resources. It's actually a pretty big, long URL to get to the actual list. But if you just go to astrosociety.org, click education, and then click resources, there's a list down there of good astronomy in science fiction. And I was actually pretty flattered to find that my Kepler's Dozen book is on that list. So.
Great. Nice. Better that than something that happened to a friend of mine. He was intending to write, I don't think he's ever going to finish it, a 3-book historical fiction series based on the life of Dolly Madison, the wife of President James Madison. And there's a lot of stuff that's just totally made up. He did a tremendous amount of research, but there's a lot of stuff that's totally made up, because she is this almost this superhero kind of character. But his book has actually been cited as a credible source for one of the things that he made up in some other, somebody's college paper or something like that. And he found the citation, which I think is just hilarious. But on a more serious note, I don't remember where I came across this, but Charlie Jane Anders did a talk, could have been at one of the Tucson Festival of Books events, where I don't know whether she provided this as a handout or whether I was just taking furious notes. But she talked about doing the research, and going back to your comment about culture, figuring out what the culture of your world is going to be, and knowing it intimately before you actually write the book. And I'm in the midst of reading her City at the Edge in the Middle of the Night right now, and you can really see how well she did that. She did an amazing job with it. It's just little nuggets of details dropped in at just the right places that really give you a sense of the places where the story is taking place. And you'd appreciate this. The story is taking place on a planet that's tidally locked to its star.
Okay.
So there's only this very thin sliver of habitable area right at the Terminator. Mm-hmm. And not the old Terminator, where people can actually live, because you go too far sunward and it becomes blazingly hot. You go too far anti-sunward and it becomes freezing cold. Right. So yeah, she made a real interesting setup then, and then there's all the other, just the cultural stuff that goes on with it.
No, and I think just to point out another recent book that I thought was really nicely done was Autonomous by Annalee Newitz, who was it's basically, it's all about, carefully engineered medicines basically being pirated and living in a world with these computer technologies. And it really shows that she's actually a science reporter who's been sort of living and breathing these articles about this, which just goes to show you don't necessarily have to be a scientist or a professional scientist to write good science fiction.
Sure.
But again, it really does help to immerse yourself in the thinking about it. And, and I was also thinking about Sarah Pinsker's Song for a New Day, which just won the Nebula Award earlier this summer. And, what it's here it was published last year, and what's it all about? It's about a pandemic raging across the world. Of course, it's actually it's really kind of a novel about rock music, but it's rock music in this pandemic world where everyone suddenly has to be socially distanced and large gatherings are made illegal. And, again, there's not a lot of science in it, but it's clear she was paying attention to the science that developed her world. And I think a very good example of what we were talking about, science fiction sometimes isn't actually about the science, but it does still pay, but still, I think her caring about the science and about medical science and social science really paid off. And, I was reading it, I almost didn't want to read the book, for Nebula consideration, because it was so much the world we're living in, but I was glad I did. It was a really good book.
Yeah. And, that makes the point. Ben Bova, the author and editor, was the guy who I guess came up with this description the first time. He said the way you can tell whether a story is science fiction or not is if it has an element of science or technology in it. If you take that element out and the story collapses, you've got science fiction. Then, of course, the next step is, making sure that it's good science fiction, at least, so long as we don't get into the tropes of faster than light travel and time travel and those kinds of things, which we don't know that they're good science yet. They may be eventually, but we'll see.
I will, and maybe you have some examples or a favorite example as well, but recently I've been going back and watching the 2004 Battlestar Galactica. And this sort of become my poster child for what I mean when I kind of say, look at science that doesn't necessarily pay attention to or science fiction that doesn't necessarily pay attention to good science and the culture. Is I was watching it, and we're now about 2 seasons in, and I'm sort of thinking, what exactly is Baltar? As far, he's supposed to be this top scientist. Yet in some elements he's being this computer programmer and computer genius, and yet at times he's a top-notch phlebotomist taking blood samples from people and wearing a lab coat and spinning things in centrifuges. It's kind of like, did anyone actually think through what his actual training was as a character? And it's like he just sort of became the Mr. Spock scientist, and even Mr. Spock knew enough to, leave the biology to Dr. McCoy. So.
Yeah, no, I don't know that I can come up with any examples off the top of my head. Unfortunately, much of what I read tends to go in one eye and out the other. But it's, that's always the problem. I remember Harlan Ellison at a Worldcon years and years and years and years ago, ranting and raving, not that Harlan would ever do that, about a book that he had written that had been was being adapted to a TV series. I think it was The Star Lost. I'm not sure, but he actually walked away from it. He said, I don't want my name associated with it. I don't want anything more to do with it. I don't think he said, keep your money, but it was one of those things where they had just diverged so much from his story that he said, I don't want anything to do with it. Whether that had anything to do with the actual science or not, I don't know that it did, or peripherally at best. It was more that they'd just taken the story in directions that he didn't want it to go.
But yeah, I think that's an important thing in there. I mean, again, that also comes back to the Ben Bova comment you were making about, yeah, if you take the science out of the story, and the story, there isn't a story,
right?
It's not really science fiction anymore.
Yeah. Well, you can accuse Star Wars of that, because it was mostly cowboys and Indians in space with cool weapons.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Star Wars really is kind of, it really is just the, you can see all of Lucas's, influences in film in that, but you don't necessarily see a whole lot of science going on in that story, which is why, I think I have heard it referred to as science fantasy, and I think, science only in the sense that it takes place in space, but yeah, it's basically it's a space fantasy.
Yeah. Not so much science fiction as technology fiction, if you will, for all of the technological things that, the Death Star and lightsabers and on and on and on.
Mm-hmm. But even there, the technology isn't necessarily, other than maybe in the sense of the technology of the ultimate weapon. I think that kind of, and that becomes kind of a recurring theme.
Yeah.
Throughout Star Wars is we keep rebuilding the atom bomb essentially in Star Wars, and in the different trilogies, and unleashing it. Okay, well, any thoughts on any other books you might want to recommend, or maybe some parting thoughts on this? I mean, I think we've pretty much covered the subject.
Yeah, I'm thinking the same thing. At the moment, I can't think of anything else. Another book that I've got on my to-read list is called The Six. And it's, of course, now I can't remember the author, even though the book is right over there. But it's written by a guy who used to be one of the staff writers for Scientific American. So, I'm looking forward to getting to that. It will be these are I don't even remember now the details, but there are these six characters that are important to whatever scientific experiment or whatever is going on. I think they're being experimented on, as a matter of fact. So it'll be interesting when I finally get around to that one. Okay, no, that sounds good. Yeah, it's. I was going to say, as far as I've mentioned a couple of the ones that I would recommend, just from like Song of a New Day and Autonomous by Annalee Newitz in the last couple of years are ones I would recommend. I think, certainly go, I would say anyone who's interested should go take a look at the astrosociety.org and, look for some good science fiction books there. There's a lot of good stuff by people like Mike Brotherton, who did a anthology of scientists writing science fiction. That's certainly worth looking up. And I think that's pretty much where I would say. I think the point of it is, I think science still is strong in science fiction. I think it's out there, but you might just have to kind of poke between the books with wizards and dragons to find the good science. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. I think we're done. Thank you all for watching. We'll assume that you're going to watch this, or you have just watched this, and we hope you enjoyed it. And if Q&A is available later, hope we have a chance to do that.
Yeah, I'll be happy to chat with you. And sorry we don't get to see your faces out in an audience, but delighted to get to that technology exists, that science exists, that this science fiction future has progressed to the point we can come to you this way.
Absolutely.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Great. Thank you guys so much.
You bet.
I thought that was really wonderful.
Get science fiction writers talking about science fiction, and look what happens.
We probably could have gone on even longer, but I figured we probably, like you say, I think the attention span probably we went about as long as we wanted to, as we probably could.
Yeah, when you can't have the interaction, I did a Zoom panel about middle of September, but it was live, and we had people asking questions through the chat all the way through, so it was much more interactive. When you do a recorded thing like this, yeah, it's different.
There's going to be a couple of interactive panels on Saturday, but we're trying to pre-tape a bunch of it.
Right.
For example, Linda's Poetry Slam is, of course, going to have to be a live panel.
Yeah.
Because that's, everybody getting together and sharing their poetry.
Right.
But yeah, thank you again. So the plan is all of this conversation is in the cloud someplace. We have somebody who's going to work it up, go through, just make sure all the technical stuff's there, take my picture out of it, have the two of you talking, probably, like I said, split it up into 2 15-minute chunks.
Yeah, because we went 30, didn't we?
We'll figure out roughly where on Saturday it's going to be shown, and then we'll contact you with the time.
Okay.
Sounds great. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you again. You guys really were great. Okay.
Thank you for the opportunity, Scott. Good to see you. Good to see you, David.
Okay.
Good to see you, Ross. Good to see you. Bye-bye.